And good morning, everybody. We're live. Congratulations. It's Friday. You made it through the week. Another week of food safety, quality assurance, making awesome products in the bag. If nobody else will say it, Alicia and I are going to say here this morning, good job. You did a good job. Because that's kind of the hard thing with what we do, right? Is that if you do a good job, nobody notices, right? And so I want to applaud too. And so actually, I think we have in here. Here we go. I'm going to give you this too, a little applause. Just for you guys. Congratulations. If you're new here, welcome. Pull up a chair, grab your favorite drink, and join us. Here on the Food Safety Chat, we meet every Friday at this time for an hour, 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, and we talk about all things food safety. My name is Bryan Armentrout, and I'm with the Food Leadership Group. And every week, I bring an expert on to talk about a topic. And this week, I have my good friend, Alicia Swanson. Alicia, how are you doing today?
All good over here in Portland, Maine.
Ah, beautiful. Yeah, so we were talking a little bit about the weather. So how's everything looking for you for this weekend?
The weekend is not looking so good. There's some hurricanes coming that will affect New England. So,
oh my goodness.
I'll be hunkering down.
Should be a little bit of a rainy one here in Colorado as well, but it's been hot. And so the 70s are coming, which for me is like, I like that. I don't like being hot. So it's much better for me to be cold than hot. So thanks everybody for coming in here. Good to see you. Tim, always good to see Tim. Sanal, Linda, Frank, welcome everyone. Rocky Ford Food Safety. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, because there's a Rocky Ford here in Colorado, which if everyone remembers, it was part of a bad cantaloupe listeria recall that caused some illnesses and deaths. And so with, of course, Jensen Farms with that as well. Marin, nice to see you as well in Minneapolis. Great. So one of the things that I do on these chats, and everybody always laughs at me when I do this, is I want to jump into the topic, but I'm not going to do it. We're going to have our favorite beverage here. So I love that mug. Everybody, join us for a sip here this morning. Cheers.
Cheers.
Very nice. Very nice. Cara, good to see you. Cara, of course, is on the chat as well, and she always does an amazing job. Make sure and check out her posts on LinkedIn. She's got some big events coming up in Wisconsin. So if you're in that area, make sure and check out with her. And there's a golf tournament coming up, and there's some other events coming up. Tim, Tim had so there's a conversation. I don't think it's been out yet, but Tim is going to be a guest on that as well. So definitely check those out, guys, because what you'll see here as well. And good morning, Joanne. Is we're building a really amazing community here of people around food safety, because food safety is not a point of competition. We're all in this together. And the more that we can help each other out, the better we're all going to be, because we all eat, right? We're protecting the food supply, and we're also part of it as well. So don't forget that. So for today, as Alicia and I were preparing for this chat, is, okay, what's something out there that we're seeing a lot of activity around, something that can be really painful if you don't pay attention to that, and that is foreign supplier verification. If you don't follow this closely, FDA issues a lot of 483s around foreign supplier verification, don't they, Alicia?
Yes, we were looking at the database the other day, and the list just kept going, and it's for particular reasons. This is for foreign suppliers, so there's all kinds of 483s, but the list for this particular was very long. I was a little shocked.
Yeah, and part of this is, and this is kind of my personal theory around this, is when FSMA was created, Congress put some provisions in there that said, okay, FDA, we want you to start doing more audits, and we're going to really ramp this sucker up as you're going. And FDA was like, okay, fine, we need more money. Nope, you don't get any more money. You have to do with what you got. And then COVID hit, and FDA couldn't go to manufacturing locations, and so their numbers were going down and down and down. And FDA figured out how to do these audits remotely. And as part of that, it's very easy for FDA to have some people sitting at a desk and going through and calling people and saying, hi, I'm with the import division of FDA in San Diego, and we're doing an FSVP audit, and we want to see your records relative to this import entry. And go, right? And you are now on the hook. And yeah, so kind of as Amaro's here saying here as well too, and good morning to you, is clampdown FSVP resolve leaving business folks to manage supplier quality, which is true. And I'll add an additional comment on a little bit of insight I've got from that. So part of this, when the regs were being written, and this was back, Alicia, when GMA, Grocery Manufacturers Association, was still around. They've since changed their name, and they're kind of their focus to Consumer Brands Association, CBA. There were a lot of different working groups, and I was on the working group who was involved with putting together guidance information to FDA relative to FSVP. And we met with, at the time, so Sharon Mayle is no longer with FDA. She's in private practice now. Sharon was part of that team, and we worked on this and really giving an understanding to FDA of how all this foreign supplier stuff works. And originally, when FDA was looking at how to create the regs around this, they were going to create pretty tough foreign supplier regulations. And this is where things get interesting, where regulatory, scientific, and politics overlap, in that the World Health Organization and the World Trade Association was involved with this and said, hey, listen, FDA, you can't do that. That's a trade barrier. You're creating a trade barrier with onerous regulations relative to suppliers from other countries. And FDA was like, rah, 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 rah. And so they backed off. So in a lot of ways, what they did is they put the burden on us and said, okay, fine. We will write the regs so that we have a separate division within the regulations for FSVP. We'll have our FSMA regulations, and we will put the burden of those activities onto the manufacturers, which in a lot of ways we were asking FDA for anyway. So that was very interesting. So that's a little background on that. Part of this too is when you look at this, FDA is still going back to their basics, Alicia, around how they're looking at this. So number one, of course, always, right, as Jose has drilled into my head, it always comes back to adulteration and misbranding. And that does not go away. That's always the bedrock of what's written in the law. And so when FDA cites a reg and you read through the actual violations associated with that, they trace it back to those two standards. You have to meet our standards. And so this is what's kind of interesting, is FDA essentially has exported their regulations around the world and said, hey, listen, buddy, if you want to bring your products into our country, you have to play by our rules. And that put up some extra requirements, equivalency, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But you need to do that. I think, too, Alicia, this caused a lot of confusion with foreign suppliers, doesn't it? Because they don't necessarily know what they're supposed to do, right?
Yes, that's correct. And if you look, when we look at FSMA, sometimes we tend to focus on one part of it, which is the preventive controls for human food rule. And depending on the ingredient, depending on the risk of the ingredient or the supply that we're dealing with, it's possible that supplier verification is a preventive control. So you may be thinking, I am doing this already as a preventive control, but did you dig a little bit deeper? Is it foreign supplier? Where are we getting this from? And do you need to actually do a little bit more than what you're doing now as a PC, as a preventive control? So it can get a little muddled, and there are different sections.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point, because that's where sometimes people get confused. And if you're new to all of this stuff and you're not looking in the right spot, you can miss it, because as you had referenced, Alicia, 21 CFR 117, and that's where FSMA lives. And everybody's like, oh, okay, subparts A through G. But foreign supplier verification is actually under 21 CFR Part 1, Subpart L. So an entirely different area of the regulations. And you need to go to that to understand what the requirements are for that in that section of the regs.
Exactly. And, but I want to make sure I don't forget to say this. There are guidance documents out there. You're not the only one that has questions. So they did put together guidance documents. So don't forget that. Also, that's always a good reference to go to. Right.
Definitely. And part of that as well is within the regs. They put in some timelines for, if you're a smaller manufacturer, you got a little more time and these type of things. That's all gone, right? That's all gone. All of those exemptions for giving you a little more time, a little more breathing room based upon your size of your company, that doesn't apply anymore. So one of the things, Alicia, that we touched on here just a little bit ago, and I wanted to make sure everybody caught that, was equivalency. What is equivalency?
Yes, that's a good question. Let's dive into that a little bit. We do have other countries that have food safety systems in place. Some are stronger than others. We have outlined, when I say we, United States, there are 3 countries specifically right now who have food safety systems that are equivalent to the United States of America. But just because they're equivalent or in better in some cases, so I'm talking about Canada, New Zealand, and Australia specifically. Okay, so those 3. But just because they're equivalent or better doesn't mean they are exempt. They have modified requirements under the Foreign Supplier Verification (FSVP). So. Right. Let me just give a quick example, Brian, if I may, of a modified requirement. So for example, in Canada, instead of verifying that Canadian suppliers meet the USA standards for imports, you could verify that the supplier is in good standing with CFIA, which is their FDA.
Right.
So you kind of can bypass some stuff by going directly to the government reports and saying, okay, they're in good standing with them, so they're good with us.
Right.
So it's a little different.
Yeah, and just because they're in good standing doesn't mean that you're off the hook, right? You still need to understand their HACCP program, their food safety systems, what potential risks are involved with their products, how those risks are mitigated, and all these type of things. And there's some subtle little things too that when the rule first came out, the regulation relative to this. So for example, if I have a company and I have a sister company, same company, all these type of things in Canada, and I'm bringing product from sister company A into sister company B in the US, that's still a foreign supplier. You can't say, oh no, they're part of our company and it's all cool. You need to evaluate them just the same.
Yes, that's correct. And then company B that's in the other country, where are they getting some of their supplies? And is that coming over to the other company in the States? So there's a little bit more backtracking, due diligence. You just have to dig a little bit deeper.
Yep. And also you have to be careful with R&D samples, because a lot of times you think, sales samples, R&D samples, it's all good. There are still requirements around those that you need to meet. And for example, if you're bringing an R&D sample into the United States, it needs to be labeled as an R&D sample.
It must be labeled.
Yeah, and that means physical label on it. And if you don't have that, FDA can ding you for that and give you a 43, believe it or not.
Yes, I have seen it.
Me too. So as we said with the foreign suppliers, right? So there's political ramifications of how these things are being dealt with. Another thing that FDA had found out, as we talked about a little bit ago, it's very easy to FDA to audit to this program. And why is that? It's because when foods are imported into the US, number one, those companies need to be registered, and then they go in. And we'll talk a little bit more about the other side of this on the importation side of it. But we'll kind of limit the conversation right now to the database. So there's the Customs and Border database for just things that are coming in the US. Everybody's got to go through this. And if you want to import product, but there's also special information, a special database in there that you need to go in and put your information. So what the product is for and all this information. And that tells FDA who the importer of record is. And relative to that, FDA can then go into that and use that for auditing. And I've seen this with my clients, where in the San Diego office, they're not even necessarily using investigators. They're using people who are working in the import office and having them dial up and say, hi, Alicia, my name is Bryan Armentrout with FDA Import Division in San Diego. I am doing an audit and I want to review your records and your analysis for this line item, this product that was imported, And now the clock's ticking, right? You have 24 hours to get that information to FDA, don't you?
24 hours. And you never know who you're going to get on the phone. You don't know what they know. And if you don't have your records in order, Be prepared to have your product stuck at the border.
I love that saying. That's awesome. Duncan points out here, good comment here from Duncan. Nice to see you, Duncan. If it turned out internationally sourced food wasn't a higher risk than domestically produced, but controls continue to behave as it were, then you would get disproportionate risk perception and blind spots. Yeah, that's true. The assumption was that all foreign products were riskier, right? And I think that kind of gets back to the equivalency point as well. So there was a catchy little phrase that I used there as we were talking about this, right? Is importer of record. Oh my goodness, that is so important, isn't it?
And who is that?
I'll tell you this, if you can avoid being that person, give it to somebody else. You don't want to be the importer of record. And Sharon Mail said in a presentation one time when she was still with FDA, I think it was at an SQF conference, that, yeah, if you want to cheese off FDA, give them wrong information for the importer of record, because now they're chasing their tail and they're trying to track down the product. And if they send an investigator out, it could be into an empty warehouse that has no idea what you're talking about. FDA is not going to be happy with you.
Yes, that's a very true statement. And we talked, and this actually also came up when I have a client in India. So I'll be going to India in October. They have some warehouses here in the States that were getting audited. And then it appeared to where it might have been an oversight by FDA. Oh, where's this stuff coming from? Now we have to go over there and audit them. So that's like you said, you call a warehouse and they have no idea. They're just receiving goods. They bring in some paperwork and maybe file it, but do they understand what that paperwork is?
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding that, because part of this, right, is setting up this importer of record, because there's lots of brokers and distributors who bring these products into the US and they become the importer of record. But you need to flat out ask them, right, as you're developing these things, are you the importer of record and what does that mean? Because unfortunately, a lot of times too, Alicia, what you'll see in this area is if you're dealing with a broker, and this goes all the way back pre-FSMA, is, hey, listen, I need to understand this thing that I'm buying from you. So let's say you're buying tomato paste from Italy, and they're selling you this paste, and they're like, okay, we're selling you this. And you're like, okay, well, where are you buying this from? And they would get very nervous because they were worried that you would then bypass them and just go and buy directly from that manufacturer. But you can't bypass that. The importer of record, the broker, is not the manufacturer. You need to understand who is making it, right? It always has to be who is that company and who is that plant. So if you're dealing with a big company and they have multiple plants and you're buying from 3 of those plants, you have to approve all 3 of those plants.
That's correct. Yeah. I'm just agreeing with you. You nailed it on the head. It's same company, but it's a different environment, right? And they had different cultures. Whether even if it's in a different state, you need to approve every single factory that could potentially send you materials.
Right, and that brokerage, you need to make sure that they understand, and you have it in your contract language, that they can't change. Right. So that broker might get a screaming hot deal on some tomato paste from another manufacturer in Italy, and they want to send you that. And if they don't tell you, you haven't approved that facility. And if FDA does an audit, you're in trouble. You're going to get 43.
Yes. And that also brings up a point about backup suppliers for your key ingredients. So, which is another requirement that's, written in there. Again, key ingredients and based on risk. So if the broker runs out of that paste, not understanding the rule completely, they may just say, okay, but I'm just going to get it from this guy. And that's not allowed. Unless they're also approved.
Yep. You have to watch that really, really closely. And it's not in our notes for today, but I wanted to bring this up because there's some weird stuff out there relative to foreign suppliers that you need to be aware of. And that is commodity type items. So, for example, palm oil or cocoa in some instances, sugar, things that we use in food a lot are traded all over the world. There are brokerage houses that deal in these commodities and trade them, right? There's a big one in London. There's a lot of work that's done on the East Coast with this as well. And so, for example, sugar, it's traded all over the world depending upon spot markets and pricing and FOB and all this fun logistics stuff. And so anytime you're dealing with a futures type product, the chance of that being traded around the world are high. So if you're buying sugar from Mexico out of Cordova and it's coming into the US and it's coming from a particular set of mills who are part of a cooperative down there that you've approved, that can change. So that shipment of sugar, that 30,000 metric tons of sugar that's on a ship steaming up to Philadelphia, may get sold in transit to someone else because they get a better price. Okay. And you may get sugar from somewhere else as a substitute. You can't let that happen, right? So part of this as well is making sure that you understand those supply chains and the risk associated with this. And this goes back to the conversations we had with FDA as part of GMA. Is FDA needs to understand that for particular instances such as that, the risk associated with that raw material is tied more to the raw material than it is to the manufacturing facility. And they understand that to a degree, but it was never written in the regs. So if you're dealing with those type of things, you need to understand that. In a lot of ways, this is where it becomes really, really important to have outside counsel and help associated with these type of things to make sure that you're covered. Because imagine if you're a manufacturer, because sugar, right? Oh my goodness, right? Lots and lots and lots of sugar comes into the U.S. And if you get slapped with a import refusal or your product is detained or things like this because you don't have the right paperwork in place, you're in trouble, right? You could be shutting down your facilities. And now all of a sudden the company president is in your office asking what the heck is wrong. And you've got to scramble. So don't get caught with that for sure.
And quite frankly, depending on the size of your company or just how good your system is, you should have a contingency plan in place too. And this should be part of your contingency. What if something happens?
Yeah.
Like a war and it affects supply. What do we do?
Yep. So part of this as well, and guys, definitely chime in for this as we're going through this. Alicia and I wrote down, what are some of those threats? What are some of those things you need to worry about with foreign suppliers that you may not have to think about as much with domestic suppliers? Now, of course, there's bad actors everywhere, and there's good actors too. But as they said back during the Cold War, trust but verify. Right? So you need to make sure that you're following these things. So the first one I came up with is auditing. Right? Everybody has this problem. You always have more suppliers, and as you were talking about, Alicia, backup suppliers too. And how in the world do you afford to go out and audit everybody? You can't do it.
No, you can't. And remember, FSVP describes who and how your foreign suppliers will be monitored by the industry. So there are suggestions and guidance of getting records, and that's part of the verification. If you can't audit them yourself, one of the recommendations is that you go on site once a year, again, based on raw material. And you said that's not always feasible. So what can we do? It is very costly. It's not that easy. How we need to work with our suppliers and work with the other companies to make sure that we are, now I'm just like kind of rambling, just to make sure that we're all copacetic.
Yeah, exactly. Because part of this, because you're dealing with a long distance relationship, and you may or may not know the party on the other side of this arrangement. This is a separate topic around food fraud, but one of the things that they've been figuring out, right? So honey has been a huge problem with food fraud forever, right?
Yes.
So a lot of companies do not allow Chinese honey because they were using antibiotics and things like this, chloramphenicol, which would show up in the honey, or adulteration of the honey because they're adding in other types of sugars and things like this. And people are like, nope, we're done. We're not getting any honey from China. Well, okay, you're in China. What do you do? So it looks like, and this hasn't been verified, but this is what I've heard through different sources, is that honey from China goes to other countries like Vietnam or things like this. And then they swap out the labels and ta-da, it's now Vietnamese honey. And how did they find this out? They found this out because now all of a sudden, tiny little Vietnam that makes a little bit of honey is making massive amounts of honey. And people are like, where? No, your supply base hasn't changed. So where's this coming from? Then they were able to figure out that was what was going on. So you have to be really, really careful with these type of things. And I think the message here, Alicia, is don't judge paperwork. And this applies for any supplier. Don't just take that paperwork and say, oh, okay, I'm good, right? And file it away. Because there are people out there who will fool you. Fake certificates, right? We were talking about this. Hey, send me your certificate for your last audit from GFSI or things like this. Oh, here you go. There are fake certificates. They're not that hard to make. TUV, International Auditing Company, actually has on their website, and I'll put this in the show notes that we'll put in the Food Safety Chat database, has a listing of companies that they have caught counterfeiting their certificates.
Yes, and not just certificates, but any document that they can send you, like lab results. You getting lab results that look the same, carbon copy, maybe the date's different, lot code is different, but just something is, what's going on? Are they just changing that? So yeah, you have to really look at this stuff.
Yeah, and things like this too, like, hey, send me a sample of your material. And then you get it in and you test, and you're like, this is an amazing ingredient. I love this. Okay, is that really what you're going to be receiving?
Right. So continued testing is one way you can help verify this stuff.
Exactly. I had a supplier, a brand new supplier in a previous company that I worked with, and we didn't know boo about these guys. And that's hint number one, right? It's not necessarily the commodity or the ingredient itself that you need to look about. It's the people side of things too. So this potential supplier that we were looking at, nobody knew. They were brand new. This is a brand new product that the company was launching. And they're like, okay, well, we need to get these guys approved right away. And that's part of the challenge too, right, is time. Because when these things happen, right, it's always like, get this done. And so we got some documentation in, and I took a look at it, and I was like, I got some questions on this HACCP plan. So let's get the owner of the company on the phone. And they were on the other side of the world. Got this guy on the phone, started asking him some questions. And about 5 minutes into the conversation, he goes, you know what, Bryan? I'm just going to be honest with you. Uh-oh, right. That's a bad thing right there. He says, I want to import my product into the US, and I understand there's all these requirements. And so I went to the local university and had them put together this food safety plan for me so that we could import. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, I mean, it's just some, we make good stuff, but we just don't understand all these rules. Guess who was on a plane to visit that supplier the next week? I was, right? And they were okay, but they didn't meet the requirements, right? So if you just take that documentation and go, okay, it's all good, and you file it away, you could be in for a very rude awakening.
Yes, you could. And again, they do have to keep up with our standards. So HACCP plus the preventive control rule and all of that follows under it. Do they have a PCQI? Do they have a QI? So it's not just the paperwork, but it's then digging deeper, which I think is the big takeaway here today is you need to continue digging. All of those things, do they have all of those things in place?
Exactly. And what is that supply chain going to look like? Because a lot of times there's lots of people who are going to be involved in this process. So you have a factory which ships to a distributor, which sends it to the port, which gets transferred to a broker, which gets transloaded onto a ship, which goes to who knows where else, right? You need to understand where that is going across the sea. What port is it going to end up in? Who is handling the documentation side of it as well? And making sure that there are no risks associated with that process in the way. So for example, previous company with me, we would have product that would be imported from Mexico into the US. And this was on rail cars. And rail cars would get broken into in Mexico. So they would be sitting at a rail detention yard waiting to transload over to a new train that would bring it over to the US and things like this. They would break in and steal stuff out of the rail cars. Now your biosecurity is potentially compromised as well. You need to understand these things.
Yes, and shelf life of the product. I mean, most of the time they do have a longer shelf stable ingredients are coming over, but if it is detained, it's just expiring as the days go by.
Yeah, exactly. And so you had mentioned earlier we'll bring up this example a little bit more, but I wanted to make sure that we kind of put a line under this so that we don't forget it, is when you're looking at their food safety plan or their HACCP plan or things like this, understanding those risks. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So with that, then, are changes in the market. And my goodness, so the war in Ukraine, and this guy here, I didn't know a whole lot of this, but Ukraine supplies a lot of different commodities around the world. Wheat, one of the largest growers of wheat. Sunflower oil. Oh my goodness, who would, a ton of sunflower oil comes out of Ukraine. And if you're making a beverage or things like this and you have that oil in your formulation, now you got a problem, because your suppliers, and this gets back to your point, Alicia, as well, is those secondary suppliers. So if you have two suppliers in Ukraine, yeah, they're probably both going to be unable to ship. So thinking about those contingencies is really important.
Yes. And yes.
Now also throw into that, now that commodity is scarce, which drives up the price, which now attracts people who commit food fraud. Sure, I've got sunflower oil, kind of, sorta. I'll give you a really good deal on it if you buy it right now. Right? I'll meet you at the port.
Right. Be wary of if it's too good to be true. It probably is.
That's a good way to think about things. So you need to be aware of that. Saul had a good question here. Let's pull this up here. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming, guys. Now that FDA has stated that GFSI audits meet the requirements for preventive controls and align with FDA regs, kind of, do you think that it's going to make things easier for forward supplier verification? What do you think, Alicia?
I think in theory it should. But practice is always different than what we have intended, and from the beginning. So
yeah. I mean, it all comes back to, and this is kind of be careful what you wish for type conversation, in that when industry talked with FDA, like through our GMA conversations and things like this, we really pushed back on them. And I talked with them about this myself relative to risk of materials. So there are inherent risks associated with certain categories, but it also depends upon usage. And that's why the food safety plans and these type of things become very important. So for example, if you are bringing non-fat dry milk into the US, and if you are then a manufacturer that makes pet food versus a manufacturer that makes infant formula, completely different risk profiles associated with those raw materials. Same stuff, same supplier, but the plants approach it differently. And FDA needs to understand that context. And I think really kind of a light bulb went off at that point in time with them, is how they started to approach this, and applauding FDA for their willingness to wrap their minds around how to manage these type of things, because it does vary, which really gets back into our next point, which is verification, right? Which is a huge, huge piece of this. And again, you simply cannot just gather the documents, Alicia, and say, I'm all good. If FDA calls, I'm covered.
Right. And to Sanal's point with GFSI, you get you get a GFSI audit report. They've scored very high. Okay. So we talked about this a couple of episodes ago, where did you really earn that score? So what are you looking at? So even though FDA would say it's equivalent, is it? And what are you looking for? So verifying everything that you do get.
Exactly. And part of this then is understanding, as we've been talking about through this whole conversation, is you may be emailing back and forth. You may have a video conference on Zoom or things like this, but you need to understand the other party on the other side of this and what their objectives are. And I think a good example for this from my past was cinnamon. So I'm not tightly dialed into the spice world, and as we all know, spices are come from all over the world. And I knew a little bit. So, for example, ground spices are going to be riskier than whole spices because you can add stuff. We all remember, I'm pretty sure, this example. Remember the cumin a number of years ago, where it was ground cumin coming out of, I think it was India, and somebody in the supply chain, right? Which is why you need to understand your supply chain. Somebody was adding peanut shells to the cumin, grinding it up, right? They were cutting it and making it cheaper, food fraud, right? They're adulterating it and misbranding as well, and adding an allergen. Oh my goodness. And just by luck, somebody in the US happened to stumble upon and find that and get this stuff off the market. You never know what's going on the other side.
Yes, and spices in particular is one of the leading foods for food fraud because of that, and it's risk based. So again, it comes down to that. It's risk based. All of our programs are based off of risk. But do you know what the risk is? Just like you said, for dog food versus human food or something different.
Exactly. And as I often talk about on here as well, is the documentation is part of the story. But if FDA is auditing you on these things, you need to be able to explain all of these type of things, because a lot of times you have things that you're doing, but conversely, that also means there's things that you're not doing. So why are you not doing lot testing for every raw material that's coming in? Why are you not visiting every single supplier? These type of things. And having conversations and understanding how you're going to answer those questions to FDA in advance. Now, back to my cinnamon story. So there was a potential supplier of this cinnamon in Vietnam. And so I went online and did research around how cinnamon is produced. And I mean, they have these trees. It's fascinating, right? You have these cinnamon trees, and they take the bark off and these type of things, right? Which you see these curly cues that you can buy and put in your drink and things like this. But when you go out and you look in FDA's Appendix 1 with, suggested hazards, I went to that. And oh, by the way, I'm going to put all of these links in the notes document that will go in the chat database. And so if you're subscribed to that, you'll be able to get all this information. And I started looking at all of the risks for cinnamon. Holy moly, there's a lot of risks. And micro and heavy metals and things like this, right? It's a very...
it's an agricultural commodity.
Yeah, it's an agricultural commodity, right? They're taking the stuff off the tree and off she goes. And so I started having conversations with that importer on cinnamon because I needed to understand this so that I could ask the right questions. And the answers I got back on how they control those risks, they didn't. It's like, no, we're just selling you cinnamon. We don't know, right? So
we've been doing it for years.
I learned from that conversation that they have no idea of what the regulations are in the U.S. relative to control of risks and hazards. Didn't have a food safety plan, things like this, right? So they were a small operation that didn't understand all these type of activities. And I also found out that other areas of the world are much more important for the manufacture of cinnamon. So in India and Sri Lanka and things like this, Vietnam is a very minor player in these things. So the supply chain and the support network associated with that is very limited. So did we end up buying from that supplier? Heck no, right? I went back to the procurement group and said, there's a reason why this stuff is so cheap. Right? You need to find another supplier, and here's why. Right? And again, right, you can't be in quality and food safety and be a jerk about these things. You need to go back to these groups and explain why these things won't work. And what you want to do then with the procurement group is make sure they understand this so that when they're having those conversations with new potential suppliers for cinnamon, in this example, they start asking those questions up front so that it saves me the trouble down the line. Because if they can disqualify people up front through that initial pass, great. That's wonderful, right? It prevents a lot of issues.
Yeah. More and more departments need to understand rules around food safety if they play a small role in procurement and sales. Also, they definitely need to understand you can't just buy anything.
Exactly. And part of this then too is you're going through all this work, you get the documentation, you're reviewing their food safety plans, their HACCP plans, all these type of things. And then also is testing, right? You may need to have, it all depends on your confidence level and the risk associated with these materials. You may need to have a testing program set up and pulling samples at the facility from the actual material that's coming in and do additional testing to make sure you're getting what you think you're getting.
Yes. So with each new lot would, potentially be. And again, it's never 100%, but it's definitely a good starting point.
Absolutely. And so part of this then is also making sure that procurement understands that if they're doing just in time on imported ingredients, that's a bad idea. They need to make sure they have enough inventory in hand and that this stuff is getting into the manufacturing facility in a timely manner so they can go on hold and be held while you're doing this testing. Because if it's going in the facility and this 40-foot container arrives and the company is going, oh my God, we need to use this tomorrow in order to not shut the plant down, that's a bad spot to be in. Make sure you have enough material.
Yes. Yes.
And do you remember, what was it, a year ago or so, maybe a little longer now, all the issues they had at the ports, right? Where all these containers were just stacked up everywhere and no one could unload them. No one could check them. There wasn't enough equipment to get them out. Now imagine that's your material sitting there at the port. I imagine some of the people on this call, it was, and you can't get it to your plant.
So it doesn't all apply to everybody, but are you sure that it doesn't apply to you? So this is one of those programs where you need to make sure, let me stop and think for a second. Do I have any raw materials that I need to look into?
Yep, absolutely. And so the big key takeaway then with and this is something that you absolutely have to understand. This gets back to your earlier comments, Alicia, around the HACCP and the food safety plan and these type of things. Are they sending you hazards that they require you to control?
Absolutely. And that's part of the food safety plan as well. It should be outlined in there. Who's controlling the hazard? Right.
Yeah. So back to that cinnamon example, and that's kind of what triggered it with me for that cinnamon example, is there was all of these risks of these different pathogens that FDA had identified that they were, and I asked them, I'm like, okay, well, these are potential risks. Are you guys looking at these and doing testing to make sure that there's no risk? No, we're not. That's a risk, right? It was kind of the response I got back. So they had no clue.
Yeah, the assumption is that, the manufacturer is going to take care of it with whatever they're using it for.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty big assumption.
That is. And so part of what we wanted to do here on the chat today is kind of dive into what are some of the tools that you could potentially use out there to start looking at this stuff and saying, okay, the procurement group has come to me and they're asking all these type of things. How can I track these things down and figure out if this is a risk or not? So the first thing here is the FDA dashboard, Alicia. And this is an awesome tool, right?
Yes, absolutely. And the pie chart in the lower right.
Yep, so this guy over here?
Yep, the 11% is for undeveloped FSVP program. Is that about 11%?
Yep, right there.
That's pretty decent amount.
Yeah, and when you read through these warning letters, I put a lot of these in locals when I see them. It's flat out, this company did not have a developed foreign supplier verification food safety plan in place.
Yeah.
Right. Where do you go from there? It's nothing, right? It's nothing. And so part of this too, right, is you can get then a good idea of, you see here in this graph, Alicia, the number of domestic and foreign inspections that FDA is performing. And I always bring this little footnote up to make sure that people understand this, is FDA's calendar is not the same as the calendar, right? January to December. FDA's calendar is a quarter off. So FDA's fiscal year ends in October. So October, November, December, moving forward, Q4 is actually their new year. So if you're doing a comparison year to year and you don't keep that into account when you're going through this data, your numbers are going to be a little wonky. So just a little heads up on that. But you can definitely see here, Alicia, right? So COVID, bam, right? Everybody's all locked down, not a lot of inspections going on, and it dropped way, way off. And you can see here, right? Ticking up, right? So FDA is ramping up their inspections significantly. And these are, I believe, the actual physical inspections. So FDA is ramping up their activities here. You can go through here, as Alicia pointed out correctly, those citations. You can then also see where most of the domestic inspections are taking place, right? So as you would expect, California, way out in front of everybody else, which makes sense. You can also then do the inspection details. And this right here, download the inspection data set. You can actually download these. And a lot of times when we do other shows where we're doing analysis of data, this is where we go to get the most current data set. You can then put this into Excel. This is a CSV file, or you can put it in, if you're using Mac, you can put it in Numbers and look at it that way as well too. So you can also see then the types of classification, the details, all kinds of good information here, right? So you have the different type of violations here, right? So no action, violation indicated, observation, these type of things, right? So you can look at all this data, go through this and the data set here. So world of information right there at your fingertips.
Yes, good starting point.
Yep. So let's see. So next up is, and this is kind of a fun page, is the import alert page. So let's see how successful I am here at switching over and sharing my screen for this. So we want the import alerts. Hey, look at that. Can you see that? There we go. Awesome. Awesome. So this is another important page with the import alerts. So part of your due diligence around looking at your foreign suppliers is, are they a good player? And one of the ways to help identify that is, are there import alerts? Are they being stopped? Are there products on a list that FDA is concerned about? So you have some definitions here. And this then, Alicia, can take you to other links within the system and you can get more information, right? So what's the purpose of an import alert? Where can I find a list of these guys? And we'll take a look at this here next. But down here, there's some important information relative to import alerts and how you can read these reports. And you have down here, and you'll often hear this. Let's see. Yeah, here they are. Red, green, and yellow. Right? And so these terms for me, Alicia, I don't know about you, but they are for me, can be a little confusing. So red, pretty obvious. So a food that was previously shown to contain bacteria and caused a foodborne illness. If you're on the red list, right, that product is not coming in. Green list, this is interesting. And so this is my interpretation. And if I'm incorrect on this, guys, let me know, is that you have a product that FDA is worried about. So in this particular example, they're talking about soft cheeses from France. So there's been lots of recalls, lots of issue with listeria. France, of course, has raw milk cheeses. And if you're a hard cheese over a certain age, you're still okay. But if you're a soft cheese, FDA is like, oh, these are risks. But what they're saying here with green is, okay, fine, we recognize there's a risk, but this company has an exemption because, let's say, for example, they're doing finished product testing, they're sharing this data with FDA, and FDA has said, okay, fine, we're going to put you on the green list for this particular item and allow this for importation. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And then yellow is an interesting one here, right? So as FDA identifies foreign facilities that have food safety controls in place, entries, and I have no idea what this term is, ACKEE, haven't figured that one out yet. And that's always part of the problem when you're dealing with governmental organizations is an acronyms and alphabet soup, right? So I don't know what that is. If anybody knows what that stands for, I'd love to hear it. So this can then enter, right? So firms and products in countries subjected to intensified surveillance or may have satisfied GMP issues, but there's warnings out there, right? So yellow, right? So it's kind of something that you need a heads up on. Is that a fair assumption, or does that just sound like a bunch of gobbledygook?
No, it's just like any other red, green, yellow, but the yellow is just, okay, just dig a little deeper.
Exactly. So Sanal had a question here. So from the FDA database for the 480Cs, does it seem the majority are on ready-to-eat foods, or is it both ready-to-eat and not ready-to-eat? Well, I'd say it's both. And when you download the data, you can go through, and then what I do, and I'll show an example of this here later as well, is you can put it in a Excel file and filter it. And I tell you what, let's pull that guy up right now. I'm really pressing my luck here today, Alicia.
So far, so good.
And so I'm going to put this database in here as well. Now, let's see. So where are you? Oh, I know you were open. There you are. Might just have to share my screen. Import alert window. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Here's the next fun guy. So this lovely, happy database is the FDA refusal entry. And this is one of the more important ones for you to look at. So with this, what I've done is I exported this data, and now I put this in Excel and I've filtered this up here in row 1, as you can see, Alicia. And there's a lot of information here that's for FDA's purpose, and you don't necessarily need to worry about, but things like this, right? So the legal name of the company, their manufacturing firm number, right? That's super important. Address, yeah, okay. I want to know the country, and I want to know what the heck happened, right? So with this refusal, meaning FDA said, nope, this is not coming in the country. So gel cups, right? We know this one. So these are a choking hazard. So FDA said these products are not allowed in the US because they're marketed to children. They have a size that allows these to be caught in a child's throat when they're eating it. And people have died because of this. We're not going to allow this in the US. So for example, if you are buying product from JSL Foodstuff here in China, that's a no-go, right? This is probably a company you don't want to deal with. So with this, you can then take this database in, Alicia, and say, okay, you can sort it by country, right? So you're going to have to figure out what these country abbreviations are, but you can figure that out based upon information over here. And was it analyzed? What were the refusal charges?
And
Try finding these.
That, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead,
that
please.
Raw material that it says no. Also, still, if you're getting something different from them, they still, you still need to look. It's still on a red list.
Exactly. And I'm going to put this database in the food safety chat database as well, so that people can play around with that and get an idea of how to use it. So that's the import refusals. Another good source, and I talk about this all the time because it's so awesome, and I can't thank him enough, is Sean Stevens and his Food Industry Council recall database, right? Go to the recall database. I just put the link in there.
Every day.
And type in the commodity, type in the company, and bam, it's going to pull that information up.
Yeah. These are great ways to keep doing your research on a daily basis without having to, make phone calls and wait for emails that are in a different time zone. You can keep up to date with some of this stuff every day.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's becoming clear when you're looking at bringing in products from other countries, there's a lot of legwork here. You got to do your due diligence, to your point.
And it's confusing, and it's okay that it's confusing, but keep digging, ask the right questions, talk to the right people. You'll get your answers, and then you'll be able to determine, do I even want to, bring this ingredient in? Maybe I need to look in-house.
Yeah, and building on that in-house point, Alicia, is my recommendation is that there's a rule in quality, which we all know, which is if 2 people are in charge of something, nobody is. So you need to identify in your company who is the key point of contact for foreign supplier verification. Is that going to be somebody in quality? Is it going to be somebody in procurement? So that when these type of questions come up, there's somebody to go to, and that person can go get training. That person can then build resources. This is something I talk about a lot, is you need a good food safety lawyer who can assist you if you have a recall or crisis management and can help you manage these situations. And you need to build that relationship in advance. It's the same with this. You need to build those resources and figure out in advance, because what's that saying is the last time that you want to get to know your neighbor is when your house is on fire. Okay? Build the bridges in advance so that you can call this person and say, hey, listen, yeah, I'm looking at this particular issue. It's their job to manage these things. And so they're going to be an extremely valuable resource.
Yeah. And right now typically does fall in the quality and food safety department because, they don't have enough to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Let's see. So Frank here had a question for us. Thank you for the question, Frank. Is there a checklist available that outlines all the documentation needed for foreign supplier verification?
There are checklists. Yes. I will get that to Bryan, and then Bryan can add it to the subscription page.
Yep. And again, even with a list like this, every situation is different. right?
That's
So
not all encompassing.
exactly. So some things may apply, some things may not. So you have to figure all these different things out. I see that Duncan put a resource in here for everybody. Thank you, Duncan. Duncan's awesome. I love this. So foodindustryhub.com, supply chain monitoring of risk and things like this. And again, as it's kind of popped up in this conversation as well, is these things overlap. Is quality assurance. Are you buying good material that's going to meet your needs? Does it have enough shelf life? Does it meet your specifications? All these type of things. So for example, if you're looking at oils, is it rancid, right? Has it been sitting around in a warehouse for 2 years or who knows what? All of these type of things need to be evaluated. Food safety, right? Of course, food safety, but now food fraud, supply chain, all of these elements are coming into play. So another perfect example of how when you're dealing in food safety and these type of things, right, we're kind of playing in all kinds of different things. And we have to understand these so that we can be conversant in the language, because now you're dealing with people who don't live in our world. You're talking with brokers and shipping companies and distributors and warehouses, and you need to understand all of these type of things.
Yeah, they just have different priorities, different agendas. And like with the brokers, they don't understand why you're asking these questions. They think you're trying to find out who their supplier is. And it's,
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times too, that can be a red flag, because there are brokers out there who are still fighting this. Right? They don't think that this is their job.
Mhm.
And
They don't
if you
think that. And who is doing it?
exactly, and who is actually, if you're bringing in products to the U.S., who is the person who's actually going into the Customs Border Protection database for importation under FSVP and putting this information in? Because there's different codes that need to go in, and your company has a code and these type of things. And I've had this experience where FDA audits importation records under FSVP, and the broker has put in the wrong information, wrong product codes, wrong, they just simply did a translation error. And now all of a sudden FDA is saying, oh, okay, well, we show here that you're bringing frozen pizza in the country or something like that. And you're like, what? No, wait, what? Right? Now you got to untangle that. And now you look like an idiot because FDA is saying, well, why is this wrong? And you just don't get in that situation.
Definitely opened up a can of worms when you do something wrong, or if you don't know something.
Yep, absolutely. So let me throw in here, of course, guys, the locals group. Whenever I keep a close eye on this stuff. And when I see import alerts around this, where I think people can learn a lesson from what a company did so that you can prevent it, that's in the locals group. Free to sign up. There's the link. Doesn't cost you anything. 2 or 3 times a week, I go in there and put updates relative to recalls and things like this. Are these special sources? No, it's just that I'm going through this information myself and hopefully saving you a little bit of time. So hopefully that'll help on that side. And of course, the other thing is the food safety chat database, where all this information is going to be uploaded into. And with that, right, and this is what, episode 145 now. So we're getting to 150 here pretty quick. Been doing this now for almost 3 years. And with that, all of that information is in this database and searchable, where you can get this and then dial into a particular subject and listen to what experts like Alicia had to say on the subject. So brilliant. So check that out and let me know what you think on that too. So what other things do you have coming up here, Alicia? What's going on in your world?
Well, I will be traveling to India, next month, and I'm very excited to see how their food safety systems work. So that's going to be exciting. I'll have a little bit more to report back after that, I'm sure.
Oh, that would be an amazing chat. So once you get back, then we can get your report from the field and what you learned.
Yeah.
Such an important trading partner for us. So that's super important. Yeah. Very good. So with that, guys, out of time already. But hopefully we were able to balance today, and this was our objective. So hopefully we got this for you, is an overview, kind of the high level of the theory associated with this, and then a little bit more of the nuts and bolts around how you actually go about looking at this information so that you can manage this within your business. Now, with that, we've kind of laid out a few breadcrumbs relative to this, but this isn't everything for sure. So don't rely just on this. Don't rely just on the checklist to that point, right? There's a lot of things that need to take place to have a successful program. And the last time you want to find this out is when you're on the phone with FDA that you have a bad system.
Yes. So foreign supplier, see if it applies to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to everybody in the chat and everybody who invested an hour here on this Friday to improve your knowledge around food safety. Thank you for being here. And thank you everyone for the amazing questions and comments and sharing of resources. It just makes me happy when I see that. So thank you for doing that. On behalf of myself and Alicia, thanks again for being here. And join us next week at the same time. We live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. And I'll bring another expert on the chat here, and we'll have another hopefully interesting conversation, because this one was crazy interesting today, for food safety. So in the meantime, sit back in your chair, enjoy the weekend. You did a good job, and we'll see you back here next Friday. Thanks again, Alicia. Fantastic chat.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you soon.